guide human societies around the globe in their innumerable interactions with natural milieu, in agriculture, in animal husbandry, hunting, fishing, and gathering, struggles against diseases and injury, naming and explanation of natural phenomena, and a strategy to cope with fluctuating environment. The value of this definition, we thought, is not only quite comprehensive, but it also gives various dimensions to the understanding of what so-called indigenous or traditional knowledge in itself. For example, traditional knowledge is knowledge about life and living associated with societies of the world outside the Western Imperium. It is a knowledge that has been created by every society, from language to technology, philosophy, and art. Every society has traditional knowledge in this sense, including societies of the West, many of which still maintain traditional craft and techniques, heritage areas, food tradition, for instance. This knowledge system is the largest possible sense of the term, ensure the survival of this society several hundreds of years. Their sustainability features are therefore exemplary. Indigenous knowledge, in some discussion, is explicitly restricted to the knowledge of systems of group described as indigenous people, societies, or remnants of society left behind after colonial conquest, like that of indigenous people of the USA, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, or the Pacific Islands. However, this has been would be a subclass of traditional or indigenous knowledge as described just now. For example, in a society like India, which is still governed by traditional knowledge in a substantive way, there would be a large group of people, sometimes called tribes and forest dweller, who would also fit the description of indigenous as per what we've been talking about. The other one is cultural knowledge, is another name for knowledge that is known only to people of a particular culture and circumscribed by that culture. It may seem meaningless or to the people outside of that culture. However, it is a narrower term than traditional knowledge, but is sometimes used as a substitute. Ecological knowledge is another, by definition, knowledge of local ecosystem, how this functions and how one should interact with them. It is very difficult for the global system to have an intimate knowledge of such system. It is only people enmeshed in them who have better understanding of their features, whether this ecosystem are large and small. Local knowledge as such is a community knowledge, is a knowledge held by local persons of their localities, including settlement in which they reside. It is sometimes emerges in an ethnographic sort of literature. It is then up to us, I hope in this particular conference, to come to kind of an understanding what do we mean by indigenous knowledge, or whatever are the words that we decide at the end of this conference to use, in the idea of trying to mainstream it and also to bring it to par with so-called the modern knowledge system today. In that particular context, I think we have been working with the multi-diversity group and try to actually come to a kind of a categorization, and we thought there is at least 4 kind of categorization that we can look into. One is called the academic group that engage indigenous system or indigenous knowledge with conventional Western knowledge in a conversation that may benefit both. The prime description of this exchange is what we call negotiation. Group 2 is academic communities that are working with the objectives of making the indigenous knowledge the primary knowledge system for social reproduction or transmission. The best known of this category is Alaska Native Knowledge Network, based on the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, of which we are having detailed presentation during this conference. The prime motive behind this, it seems, rehabilitation. Group 3 is a third academic group that moves out of the university into an area of community knowledge, sites that takes that into a firm sort of embrace. Prime examples of this is in New Tierra, Mexico, Stellenbosch, Marcus Garvey Pan-African University in Uganda, Victoria University in Canada, and even our university, AiU, where we are trying to do similar sort of engagement. And the trend for this perhaps is what we call community knowledge engagement. And the last group, group 4, it is one which is more academic, that places itself totally at the command of the community for direction in teaching and research. The best example of this, of course, is Pretrack in the Andes. The main description of this mode of academic work is public or community service. The university serves the community, and the community decides the research and the teaching or the service agenda for that university. There may be other initiatives as well, but in our opinion, the above classification would more or less be sufficient to include the initiatives that departs from the conventional Eurocentric tradition of the university, which, as I've pointed out, are themselves reaching a kind of end that probably needs to be revitalized or looked at. The categories are not exclusive, of course, and many of them are examples that we will discuss that may encroach into more categories than one or even fall in all 4. It is important to bear in mind that the leadership in moving out is not just with the content, but the pedagogical methods as well. This is what guarantees these universities to be alive and well in the future, because it will survive the crisis affecting current universities and those of our universities which are modeled on those kind of a system. None of them are based on an idea that what their cultures and histories have produced is invalid or unscientific or second-class knowledge which needs to be replaced. It has taken for a long time for the world to overcome the amnesia about this knowledge system, all of which have remained valid and relevant despite the misting of all societies by heavy blanket of what Western conception of the world. But now they stand finally on a new footing due largely to the effort of scholars assembled, hopefully from this hall, and several others who are unable to come, but even though they wish to. Further on to that, I think we want to see what sort of learning experiences that we get from various universities or various institutions that has been going on at the moment in time. And we have listed, I think, again, 3 or 4 examples. And example 1 is where we talk about negotiation within the knowledge system that can be found in South Africa, where serious effort has been made to integrate indigenous knowledge with the Western knowledge system, and some of this will be discussed in the conference in the next 2 days. South Africa, in fact, is one of the few countries to draw up national indigenous knowledge policy in 2004 with the corresponding institution to integrate into the indigenous knowledge into the conventional higher education curricula. Other initiatives in Africa focus exclusively on the use of indigenous knowledge for a host of other activities designed to result in a betterment of the program. One instance is the Early Childhood Development Virtual University, which has got a program that provides distance education capacity building program in Africa. A recent paper describes a curriculum generation activity in which students contribute to the learning process by bringing indigenous knowledge and practices into the curriculum. Indigenous knowledge is consciously brought within the higher education program dealing with this issue. This has vastly improved the quality of development program with acceptance by the village community. We also find that international organizations like UNESCO, UFIC in the Netherlands, and also certain agencies in the United Nations University, FAO, has also a similar sort of program. Group 2, in a recent survey conducted by some of our colleagues, looked into the use of indigenous system in modern universities. Again, this paper will be presented, I think, in this particular conference. It shows that the transmission has remained unchallenged, and this is because they are linked to the pursuit of economic modernization, which the system endorses in every conceivable way. In the book called Local Knowledge and Wisdom in Higher Education, it documents the role of indigenous knowledge in higher ed institutions across a number of societies. I'm glad that we have received a copy of this book, which is placed now in the library, and we will recall defining the feature of Group 2 as a kind of a rehabilitation of the indigenous knowledge system. And examples, again, is throughout many parts of the world. Significant work in this direction of association and university in the community and the indigenous knowledge has been done in the School of Public Administration in the University of Victoria, Canada. I think 2 representatives are here. Jackie is one of them. And the institution hosts the UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education, meaning I think there are recognition to this kind of approaches. In the Philippines, over the last 8 years, the Asian Council of People Culture began to assist different tribes in the society to set up schools for indigenous knowledge and tradition. And this is a parallel but separate system of education on par with the mainstream education. There are other examples of this that incorporates indigenous knowledge within the academic institution, including the original inhabitants of New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and even the US. This resurgent indigenous community, now supported by law, are seeking to situate their own cultural knowledge for the purpose of their survival in as many institutions of learning as possible, including the university. The long-standing estrangement between indigenous community and universities are now being contested. The marginal position of indigenous knowledge within the mainstream knowledge is also being seriously questioned. Of course, the Alaska Native Knowledge Network at the University of Alaska is a fine example of a grand initiative to completely revamp what is considered as a source material for higher education system that the community is comfortable with. The network has tried to overcome the long-standing estrangement between indigenous communities and the external agencies impacting their life. It also seeks to overcome the historical imbalance that we talked about by the development of collaborative research endeavors which focus exclusively on indigenous system and with the primary direction coming from the indigenous community so that they can move from passive to active role in the determination of knowledge, including research. The third group, the one that is involved in engagement, primary examples will be the one in Mexico that I've mentioned, that certifies garage mechanics. Stellenbosch University that is active in community-involved programs including waste management. Marcus Garvey Pan American University in Uganda, which sends students out to indigenous and local sites, including traditional healers, and construct its training and research program through this route. Again, we will hear a presentation from Marcus Garvey University. The Vice Chancellor is here with us in this conference. And our own university, AiU, is now developing what we call the Human University Competency Framework that allows our students to work over the 3 years beginning year 1 to year 3 to get engaged with the community, which is part of the core university curriculum, of which they must pass, otherwise they will not graduate within the university. The idea is so that they can go back and also transfer some of this knowledge directly to the community where they come from as part of giving back. So I would like to basically just to conclude that given these various initiatives that have been taken, not only within segments of our society, but also throughout the world, I think it is important for us to get in touch with some of this very current work and begin to learn from them. How do we mainstream and how do you bring traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge or whatever name that we decide to call them, so that it is become part and parcel of the international knowledge structures and system, making knowledge and learning and education as complete as possible in trying to bring, as I've mentioned again, the human person, the human being, and also to dignify them the way it should be dignified, given they are part of the larger humanity. On that note, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening.
Thank you, Datu Zulkifli, for sharing with us your insights.
We now call upon Mr. Sham Menon to give their responses.